As you probably can tell from our previous recording, that we were on a cruise ship. My goodness, there's so many rules on cruise ships, especially in the pool area. Oh, well, it's important. There's this big sign full of don't do this and don't do that. And then there was this attendant that was mopping the floor, and he yelled at the kids to stop splashing so much. And so he added another rule. Oh, that's the way rules work, I guess, isn't it? Something happens and you need a rule. Like norovirus, a big deal on cruise ships. I mean, you don't want to spend lots of money in order to throw up for a week on a cruise ship. So wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. Use the sanitizer thing. All these rules meant to keep us clean. Well, you might say they want to keep us holy. I wonder if it was that way in the church I grew up in. There was lots of unwritten rules for the kids. You remember some of them, I suppose. I have actually written them down here. Don't run in church. Kind of wish our church had that rule because I keep afraid that they're going to knock me over. Don't talk during the service. Sit still, boy. No, don't laugh. Stop laughing. Don't go to movies. Don't play cards. Don't go dancing with girls. I don't know if dancing with boys was okay. I'm not sure. Well, I learned later that it's good to laugh in church. Oh, I think Christianity has missed something of churchianity when our kids don't learn to be bored in church. It just makes you want to break rules, doesn't it? Well, Jesus was breaking rules all the time, especially rules that people had made up. He was a young troublemaker. Jesus was a young troublemaker. But okay, Jesus doesn't hate rules. I mean, the law of gravity was made through him, right? Well, you try breaking that one. Okay, so I admit some rules are important. I suppose these pool rules were important. I'm not so sure about my church rules. Sit still, boy? How do you tell a boy to sit still in church? But, you know, there are some people who just like rules for rules' own sake. They want rules. And so they keep making up new ones. As time goes by, then, these lists of rules get longer and longer and longer. I mean, have you ever seen the shelves in a lawyer's office? All those lists of statutes and rules that we actually pay the legislator to make up these rules. So my wife said to me that, well, something bad must have happened somewhere along the line and they don't want it to happen again, so they make a rule. It makes sense, I guess. Some kid running in the pool bangs his head and the parents sue the cruise line, so you got to have a rule. Or maybe some kid was running and knocked over an old person like me, and so you got to have a rule. So Jesus in our story today is defying rules about the Sabbath. Jesus was making good trouble. He's questioning the 600 plus religious rules that had accumulated over the centuries. They were written by men and were not necessarily from God any more than my church's rules for kids were from God. Like, you know, I had a dream this morning. My son likes to tell me his dreams. And so I'm going to tell you this one. I didn't know what it meant until I was revising this Bible study. What it was, I saw a beautiful building up on a hill, so I climbed up to see it. And there, I was told it was a church. And when I was inside, though, this big, beautiful building was just an empty box, painted gray and with leaks coming down the walls. Very few people attended services there anymore, I was told. Then they said that we all had to leave because the band was setting up outside for an event that was going to take place. They were preparing to worship outside the building. That beautiful building, it had become not only irrelevant, but also a problem for the worshipers who were attending there. It was more than useless. Then the scene shifted in my dream to many young people there outside the building, worshiping God with their arms linked together high over their heads, singing a worship song, dancing in a circle around me. It was a beautiful thing. And so this beautiful building and all the rules that went with this building had become irrelevant and even harmful. It's much like the temple in its religions. It had accumulated all these rules and all these people. They could actually not go to worship God in the temple if they were deformed in some way. So it brings us to the question, what makes a building or a person or even a nation holy? What makes them clean in God's eyes? What is it about them that glorifies God? What is it about church buildings and rules that glorify God? Big question. Related to the question, and then how can we worship God? And that brings us to our two stories for today. They're found in Luke 6, verses 1 through 11. It says, one Sabbath day, Jesus was walking through the grain fields. His disciples began to break some heads of grain off, and they rubbed them in their hands and ate them. Some of the Pharisees said, "Isn't it against the law to do this on the Sabbath? Why are you doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Haven't you ever read about what David did? He and his men were hungry. They entered the house of God and took the holy bread. He ate the bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. And David also gave some to his men, just like Jesus was doing with his disciples. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath day." Remember that. The next story. On another Sabbath day, Luke says, Jesus went into the synagogue, and he was teaching, which is what he apparently normally did. A man whose right hand was weak and twisted was also there. The Pharisees and teachers of the law were trying to find fault with Jesus, so they were watching him closely, and I think they were watching the disciples closely too. They wanted to see what he would do on the Sabbath, if he would heal. But Jesus knew what they were thinking. He spoke to the man who had the weak and twisted hand, "Get up and stand in front of everybody." So the man got up and stood there in front of everyone. Then Jesus said to them, "What does the law require? What does it say we should do on the Sabbath day? Should we do good? Or should we do evil?" It's kind of an obvious question, I think. What does the law say about this? Should we save a life? Or should we destroy a life? He looked around at all of them, and then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did, and his hand was as good as new. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were very angry. They began to talk with each other about what they might do with Jesus, or what they might do to him. When we read these stories, we might immediately think that it's about breaking a Sabbath rule. I mean, I started out talking about rules. So of course, that's what we think the stories are about, breaking rules. But no, I don't think that these stories are about breaking the Sabbath rule. You know, previously in Luke's stories, he has been demonstrating that Jesus is God, or at least that he claims to be God. And here he continues that claim. He makes the audacious claim to be the Lord of the Sabbath. That means he claimed to be the creator and the ruler of the Sabbath day. But God had done that in the first chapter of Genesis. God had rested on the seventh day, so they were supposed to keep it holy. The question posed in these two stories then is, how is the Sabbath day kept holy? And by the way, the Sabbath day is not Sunday. The Sabbath day was Saturday back in that day. But the real question is, what does holy even mean? Well, on a cruise ship, it meant keep your hands clean. God wants us to be clean. So, God had given the Israelites 10 laws to control their behavior. They were supposed to be more just and merciful than all those nations that surround them by these rules and laws. They were meant to keep from hurting one another and be a mercy to humans. It was meant then to glorify God, and it had become instead a way to glorify religious people. So the religious people, in order to make the people stay holy, they added 2 more books of rules, Leviticus and Numbers. And then they claimed that God had commanded Moses to write these 2 books. Yeah, I know it's controversial. Now, most of those rules were there for priests to obey. One group of religious rule lovers, were called Pharisees. And many of them were also scribes who were supposed to interpret all these scriptures. They decided that not only the priests were to obey them, but everybody else is supposed to keep them too. So as time went on, they added more rules. They were creating a kind of religious fence around people's behavior so as to keep them clean, to keep them holy. But then the fence became more important than the people. And that's what Jesus is referring to here. These rules in these stories are about keeping the Sabbath. As God said in the 10 Commandments, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The question revolves then around, what does holy even mean? And how does it reflect the character of God? And since we're made in the image of God, how is it supposed to reflect our character? How are we supposed to be holy? So, our holiness is what these stories are talking about. So let's look at them that way. What is holy? The first story is about breaking a Sabbath law regarding harvesting on the Sabbath. It shows how absurdly minuscule these laws had become by this time. Jesus' disciples were only eating a little bit of grain as they walked through a field. But my immediate question was, who allowed them to walk through the fields? I mean, a farmer today would be very upset if somebody was trampling his grain. That's what the farmer's fence is for, right? Keep those people away from walking in my field. That's what the fence of the law was for. But what did the law say? It was not permissible to take a scythe to your neighbor's field and harvest it wholesale for yourself. That would be stealing. Of course, that's not what the disciples were doing, is it? Now, no, they were just taking a little bit to snack on because they were hungry. So, who were the holy people in that story? Well, certainly not those religious men who were finding fault with Jesus' disciples. They were only looking for a way to accuse Jesus. That seems to be the reason and the extent of some people's religions. Their religions are just big empty buildings. They mostly want to spy and find fault with others. It's like a leaky roof you can't repair. That's not holy. It's not holy like God wants. Jesus, on the other hand, is permitting his disciples to feed themselves because they were hungry. Now that was holy. It was love and it was mercy with provision. It was in action. It was holiness in action. Well, the second story is even more obvious. It's about this guy in the synagogue. They all knew in town because his hand had always been deformed like that. So they all had assumed that his parents had sinned or that he had sinned. That's how they felt about deformity. It was because somebody sinned. Now Luke makes a point that it was his right hand, which tells us that it was even more dysfunctional for the guy because most people are right-handed. Why was this guy even allowed into the synagogue? He certainly wouldn't have been allowed into the temple with a deformity. I mean, that's the way the rules worked. He couldn't worship God in that condition. He had to stay outside. But Jesus noticed him. Well, Jesus probably knew him, in fact. So did the Pharisees. But then they all along knew he would be there, and that's why they were there. They were watching Jesus to see what he would do. I mean, they didn't have any doubts that Jesus could heal this guy. There were a kind of faith, I guess. But anyway, they didn't doubt it. They knew Jesus. They expected that he would heal this guy and so break the Sabbath rules. And so that's why they were there. They knew that all the people thought Jesus was this holy man, so they knew what Jesus would probably do for this guy. He'd done this kind of thing before on the Sabbath, but this time they wanted to catch him red-handed, healing on the Sabbath. But there was no rule about that, so they were making up rules again. But Jesus fooled them. He didn't do anything. I love this. He just told the man to take center stage in the synagogue in front of everyone. The poor guy put on the spot like that. But he did it, you know. He obeyed Jesus and he went and stood in the middle where everybody could see him. That showed that he had faith and trust that Jesus was about to do something good. Man, anticipation in the crowd must have been like electricity since everybody knew what was going on. Jesus paused. He turned to gaze at all the people and stopped and looked for a long time at these Pharisees and their scribes. Luke says he knew what they were thinking. Of course he knew what they were thinking. Everybody knew what they were thinking. Jesus was giving everyone time to think about this, to think about what true holiness does. So, Jesus didn't touch the man at all. No big deal, right? He just said, stick out your hand. So the man stuck out his hand. And thereby, the man healed himself. The man had performed the miracle all by himself. He acted with faith in his holy God. The faith recreated his hand, demonstrating that whatever sin had been involved, which probably was nothing, it was now irrelevant. If there was anything there, it had been forgiven. And that is the holiness of God demonstrated. Mercy and love in action for that man. That's what holiness means. Of course, Jesus had once again now bested his opponents in the most clever way, which is what he usually did. He humiliated them in front of the whole assembly, and they were furious. It says they were beside themselves, mad with anger, furious, beside themselves. That's what the Greek says. Well, everyone hates a smart ass, right? Even the Pharisees. They became furious enough to try to figure out a way to get rid of the only holy man in the room. So proving without doubt they were the evil people in the room. Whoa, Luke has really spread it on a table for us. What does God want from his people? He's made it pretty obvious. What is holiness like? Well, here's the objective test that was given to them and to us. It's in Micah 6:8, and they all had memorized this and knew it by heart. Here's the test. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to act humbly or prudently with your God. Is that you? Is that the people you vote for, put in government? Is that the person that you choose to teach you? So, our church was looking for a new pastor, and that is the wonderful advice I heard in another situation like that. Who do you choose to teach you? Is that person holy like this? Take the Micah 6:8 test for yourself. So now, Jesus has pretty much proved that the Pharisees, the Herodians, the scribes, who were in fact formerly enemies with one another, had now taken an alliance together against him. I think Jesus is doing this on purpose to demonstrate their religious pretense. They are not holy at all. They claimed to be putting a fence around the law so that the people wouldn't break it. And all the while, they're digging a tunnel under their fence so they could destroy the only keeper of the law in the room. And that's what happens to these young troublemakers. Jesus was the boss of their rules, including the Sabbath rule. But they showed how they hated God's rules by farcically pretending to defend them. Jesus is demonstrating with certainty the character of God shown in the law that he gave to the Israelites in the first place. Therefore, he is demonstrating the character of anyone claiming to be truly human, created in the image of God. And so that comes down to us, doesn't it? Are we human after all? Never mind, are we holy? Let's just ask, are we really human after all? Is it time for us to be good troublemakers like Jesus? Now that is holiness. Representative John Lewis was one of those. This is a quote from blogger Heather Cox Richardson on her Facebook page. She quotes, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair," Lewis tweeted almost exactly a year before his death. "Do not become bitter or hostile. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. We will find a way to make a way out of no way." My philosophy is very simple, Representative Lewis once told an audience. When you see something that's not right, not fair, and not just, well, say something. Do something. Get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. Just make sure, and this is my advice, just make sure it is necessary trouble. It could get you beat up like the Apostle Paul and like Representative Lewis. It could get you killed like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Like that young troublemaker Jesus. Just make sure you are doing God's good trouble and not your own. And make sure it's necessary. Oh, God, go with you. Holy people, you true human